I spent my entire life giving my daughter everything I had to give. I gave my time, my money, and my heart. Yet when her 42nd birthday arrived, her only wish was my permanent absence. Heartbroken but finally awake, I traded my home for isolation to grant her that exact peace. I faded into nothing, but my quiet disappearance uncovered a devastating financial secret she never saw coming. I was 71 years old, standing in the massive kitchen of a house I had helped pay for, carefully arranging a $600 custom floral centerpiece. The house belonged to my daughter, Savannah, and her husband, Richard Sterling. It was a Friday evening in late September. The crisp autumn air outside was entirely blocked by the heavy insulated doors of their suburban mansion. The event was supposed to be a celebration for Savannah's birthday. In reality, it was a high society networking gala for Richard. He was an investment broker who treated every family gathering like a corporate boardroom. I could hear the clinking of crystal wine glasses and the low-polished hum of expensive conversations drifting in from the formal dining room. I had worn my best navy blue dress. It was sensible, comfortable, and clean. I had purchased it 5 years ago for a church anniversary dinner. I thought I looked perfectly nice. Savannah walked into the kitchen with quick, aggressive steps. She wore a tailored emerald silk dress that likely cost more than my first automobile. Her hair was perfectly swept back, and her diamond earrings caught the bright light of the kitchen pendants. She looked beautiful, but her face was tight with stress. I smiled and turned toward her, holding a delicate white orchid to add to the heavy crystal vase. I told her happy birthday and mentioned that the caterers were doing a wonderful job. I told her I brought the flowers for the main entryway to welcome her guests. Savannah did not look at the flowers. She looked at my shoes. Then her eyes traveled slowly up to my navy dress. Her expression was completely flat, devoid of any warmth or recognition. She grabbed my arm. Her manicured fingers pressed tightly into my skin as she pulled me away from the kitchen island and toward the walk and pantry. She practically shoved me inside and shut the heavy wooden door behind us. The sudden silence in the small space felt incredibly heavy. The pantry smelled like expensive olive oil and aged balsamic vinegar. When your world shifts permanently, you tend to notice the smallest, most irrelevant details. I asked her what was wrong. I thought perhaps something had happened with the catering staff or the wine selection. Mothers always default to assuming their children are simply stressed by the logistics of life. Savannah crossed her arms tightly across her chest. She asked me what I was wearing. Her voice was a harsh, controlled whisper. I looked down at my dress and told her it was my navy dress. I asked if there was a stain on it. She let out a long, frustrated breath that echoed in the small room. She told me that everything was wrong with it. She waved her hand vaguely toward my entire body. She leaned in close and told me that Richard had important partners in the house tonight. He had senior vice presidents from his brokerage firm. She explained that these were people who managed millions of dollars and dictated social standing in their community. Then she looked me directly in the eyes and said that I was standing in her modern kitchen, looking exactly like a retired bank manager from a small town. I stood completely still. I was a retired bank manager from a small town. I had worked at our local community bank branch for 34 years, counting pennies and managing modest accounts, specifically to make sure Savannah had everything she ever wanted growing up. I told her quietly that I was just trying to help celebrate her day. I pointed out that I had brought the custom flowers she had mentioned liking weeks ago. Savannah snapped back that she did not need flowers. She needed me to understand how my presence damaged their image. She said my energy, my clothes, and the simple way I spoke to her wealthy friends simply did not fit the sophisticated aesthetic they were trying to project. I stared at my daughter. I saw the cold calculation in her eyes. There was no affection. There was no grace. She was looking at me the way an interior decorator looks at a cheap, ugly piece of furniture that is ruining the flow of an expensive room. She took another step closer to me, backing me up against the wooden shelves. She lowered her voice even more, ensuring the words would cut as deeply and permanently as possible. She said that honestly, the best gift I could give her tonight, and permanently, was my absence. She told me that my being there just reminded everyone of the ordinary life they were trying so desperately to outgrow. For my entire life, I believed that if a mother sacrificed enough, her child would eventually understand her value. I believed that unconditional love was a protective shield against cruelty. But standing in that pantry looking at the harsh lines of my daughter's face, I did not cry. A sudden freezing clarity washed over my entire body. I realized in one crushing second that my 40 years of relentless sacrifice meant absolutely nothing to her. Paying off her early credit card debts so she could maintain her credit score meant nothing. Funding Richard's first business venture when no bank would look at him meant nothing. I was not a mother to them. I was a financial transaction, and my aesthetic value had just run dry. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or demand respect. I simply looked at her and nodded my head. I told her I understood. My voice was perfectly calm, stripped of all the emotion I had carried into that house. I carefully placed the white orchid on the pantry shelf beside a jar of imported truffles. I turned around, opened the door, and walked out of the pantry. I did not go back into the main house to cause a scene. I did not say goodbye to Richard. I did not say goodbye to a single guest. I walked straight out the back door, down the stone pathway I had paid a contractor to install last spring, and out into the cool September night. I got into my car and started the engine. The engine purred quietly. I put the car in gear and drove away. I was finally awake. The drive back to my house took 45 minutes. I drove through the winding suburban streets in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I watched the streetlights pass over the windshield, casting long rhythmic shadows across the dashboard. I felt lighter than I had in over a decade. The heavy, exhausting burden of constantly trying to please a daughter who fundamentally despised me had been lifted. She had severed the cord by her own command. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always did. It was a modest, sturdy brick house sitting on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. It was the house I had shared with my late husband, Thomas. Thomas was a meticulous actuary. He spent his entire professional life calculating risks, predicting outcomes, and preparing for the worst-case scenarios in human behavior. He passed away 5 years ago from pancreatic cancer. He was a quiet, observant man, a man of numbers, logic, and undeniable truth. He had always warned me about Richard. Thomas used to sit in his worn leather recliner, tapping his pen against a legal pad, telling me that Richard was a man who built giant castles on shifting sand. I had always defended them. I had always argued that family supports family, no matter the risk. Tonight, the silence of my empty house confirmed that Thomas had been entirely correct about everything. I walked inside and turned on the dining room light. I went straight to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner where I kept my personal records. I did not sit down to mourn the loss of my daughter. I sat down to calculate the cost of my blind loyalty. I pulled out my thick green financial ledgers. I opened them flat on the dining room table under the bright overhead light. I traced my index finger down the long columns of numbers. The reality of my life stared back at me in undeniable black ink. For years, I had been quietly subsidizing Savannah and Richard's grand illusion of wealth. There it was on page 4. The property taxes on their 5-bedroom suburban home. I had been paying those taxes directly to the county for 3 consecutive years because Richard claimed his capital was temporarily tied up in high-yield investments. I turned the page. The monthly dues for Richard's exclusive country club. Savannah had begged me to cover them temporarily so Richard could continue networking with high-net-worth clients to build his portfolio. Temporary had quietly become permanent. I had paid thousands of dollars so my daughter's husband could play golf. Then I turned to the largest file in the drawer, the commercial business loan. 2 years ago, Richard desperately needed a massive injection of cash to save his failing brokerage firm. The bank required a guarantor with flawless credit and substantial unencumbered assets. I co-signed the massive loan against Thomas's strict past advice. I pulled out the most recent bank statements from the folder. Richard had missed the last 3 monthly payments. I had been hiding the warning notices, quietly covering the interest out of my own retirement savings, pretending to myself that it was just a minor administrative oversight. I sat back in my wooden dining chair. The cold clarity that had started in the pantry solidified into an unbreakable iron resolve. My daughter wanted my permanent absence. She wanted to completely erase my small-town energy from her sophisticated life. But she still desperately relied on my small-town money to keep her sophisticated life from collapsing. The conflict immediately shifted in my mind. This was no longer an emotional heartbreak about a cruel daughter. This was a tactical financial defense. If she wanted me gone, I would grant that wish with absolute completeness. But I would not leave my financial safety net behind for them to continuously drain. I pushed my chair back and walked deliberately into my bedroom. I pulled a medium-sized black suitcase from the top shelf of my closet. I did not pack my expensive china. I did not carefully wrap the silver flatware I had lovingly collected over 4 decades. I did not pack the heavy leather-bound photo albums filled with smiling pictures of a family that I now knew no longer existed. I packed only highly practical things. I packed thick sweaters, sensible walking shoes, my prescription medications, and simple toiletries. I packed only the absolute bare essentials needed for survival and comfort. I looked at the expensive gifts Savannah had bought me over the years to manage my appearance. I left the silk scarves hanging in the closet. I left the designer handbags sitting on the shelf. She had forced those items on me to improve my aesthetic value in her world. They meant absolutely nothing to me now. I closed the suitcase and zipped it shut. The sound was loud and final in the quiet room. I walked through the house one last time. I ran my hand along the back of Thomas's leather recliner. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling into my bones. I was not abandoning my home out of fear. I was escaping a beautifully disguised trap. I returned to the dining room table. I placed my green financial ledgers, my bank security tokens, and all my important identification documents into a secure locking briefcase. I was taking my entire financial life, my entire identity with me. I walked out the front door and onto the porch. The night air was crisp and smelled of falling leaves. I turned my key and locked the deadbolt. I did not write a letter explaining my feelings. I did not leave a forwarding address or a hint of my destination. I got into my car, placed the heavy briefcase securely on the passenger seat, and drove away into the dark. I faded into nothing, exactly as my daughter had requested, fully prepared to let their expensive house of cards collapse under its own weight. The bank opened at exactly 9 on Monday morning. I was the first person to step through the heavy glass doors. For 34 years, I had walked into a bank as an employee, smiling at customers and managing their minor crises from behind a polished desk. Today I walked in as a woman dismantling an empire of her own making. I sat in the plush leather chair across from Mr. Abernathy, the branch manager. He had known me and Thomas for over a decade. He poured me a cup of coffee and politely asked how Savannah's birthday party had been. I did not smile. I did not offer polite social fictions. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him I needed to execute a complete and immediate financial separation. Mr. Abernathy set his pen down slowly. He could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I handed him my green ledgers. I told him to remove my name as the primary guarantor from Richard Sterling's commercial business credit lines. I watched the manager's face turn pale. He cleared his throat nervously. He warned me that doing so would immediately freeze the accounts and trigger a mandatory balance review for Richard's firm. I told him I understood the consequences perfectly. He typed the commands into his computer. I sat quietly and watched the screen blink. With a few keystrokes, the invisible safety net I had woven under my daughter's husband was completely eradicated. I did not stop there. I instructed Mr. Abernathy to cancel the recurring automatic transfers that paid the property taxes on Savannah's 5-bedroom house. I ordered him to halt the monthly draft that covered Richard's elite country club membership. Every single pipeline of cash that kept their manufactured reality afloat was permanently severed. Finally, I transferred my entire life savings, every penny Thomas and I had accumulated, into a newly formed, highly secure trust account. I stood up, thanked the manager for his time, and walked out into the bright morning light. My hands were perfectly steady. My next stop was the downtown office of Harrison Caldwell. Harrison was a brilliant estate attorney and one of my late husband's oldest friends. He had a quiet, methodical way of speaking that always reminded me of Thomas. I sat in his mahogany-paneled office and handed him my updated financial portfolio. I told Harrison that I was leaving the city. I told him I was vacating my primary residence immediately, and that I intended to vanish entirely from my daughter's life. Harrison took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked deeply concerned. He leaned across his desk and told me that leaving a paid-off house completely empty was incredibly dangerous. He warned me that an unoccupied asset is highly vulnerable to title fraud squatters or desperate relatives trying to leverage the equity in my absence. He asked me if Richard had any old power of attorney documents. I told him yes. Richard held a general medical and financial proxy I had foolishly signed 5 years ago. Harrison sighed heavily. He said Richard could easily use that document to take out a massive loan against my empty house the moment he realized his own credit lines were frozen. I smiled for the first time that day. I told Harrison that my husband had been an actuary. Thomas had spent his entire life calculating risk. He had calculated the exact risk of Richard's greed long before the cancer took him. I leaned forward and told Harrison to review the specific addendum Thomas had secretly filed with the original property deed. Harrison opened a thick file and began reading the legal language. His eyes widened. Thomas had structured a brilliant contingency. He had embedded an occupancy and abandonment clause directly into the title. The clause explicitly stated that if I vacated the property for more than 14 consecutive days, without providing direct in-person notarized authorization, the title of the house would automatically and irreversibly transfer into a blind protective trust managed exclusively by Harrison's law firm. Any prior power of attorney would be instantly nullified. Harrison looked up at me in absolute shock and admiration. I told him that by demanding my absence and ignoring my disappearance, Savannah and Richard would unknowingly trigger the exact legal trap that would lock them out of my assets forever. By Tuesday afternoon, the house was completely silent. I had packed the trunk of my car with the heavy black suitcase and my locking briefcase. I walked through the downstairs rooms one final time. I wiped down the kitchen counters until they gleamed. I vacuumed the living room rug. I made sure every surface was perfectly clean and perfectly empty. I wanted the house to look exactly like what it was, a pristine museum of a life that was officially over. I did not leave a forwarding address on the kitchen island. I did not write a tearful note of explanation to leave on the mantel. People who write letters are asking to be found. They are asking for a response. I required absolutely nothing from them. I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt. I walked down the driveway and got into my car. Before putting the car in gear, I pulled my cell phone from my purse. I removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and tossed the pieces into the passenger footwell. I had already purchased a new prepaid phone with an unlisted number. I drove away from the curb without looking in the rearview mirror. I drove past the neighborhood park, past the grocery store where I had shopped for 30 years, and onto the highway heading north. I was fading into nothing. I was granting my daughter the exact birthday gift she had requested. I was disappearing permanently, taking all my love and all my money with me. I drove for 6 hours straight into the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The roads grew narrower and steeper the further I went. The dense canopy of pine and oak trees blocked out the afternoon sun, casting long, cool shadows across the pavement. I eventually turned onto an unpaved gravel road that wound its way up a secluded ridge. At the very top, hidden completely from the main road, sat a small off-grid log cabin. Thomas had purchased this property nearly 15 years ago. He had bought it under a private corporate name as a hunting retreat, a place where he could escape the noise of the city and watch the wildlife in absolute silence. Savannah never knew this property existed. She had never been invited, and Richard certainly had no idea it was part of our portfolio. It was my perfect sanctuary, The cabin was modest but sturdy. It had a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen with a propane refrigerator, and a wide wooden porch that overlooked a sweeping valley of endless green trees. I carried my suitcase inside. The air smelled of old pine and dust. I spent the first evening cleaning the floors and unpacking my sparse belongings. When night fell, the darkness was absolute. There were no street lights, no sounds of passing traffic, no hum of a suburban neighborhood. There was only the wind moving through the trees and the quiet settling of the timber framing. For the first time in 42 years, nobody knew where I was. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. The silence of the mountains was deafening. I wrestled constantly with the phantom habits of motherhood. Every morning I would wake up at 6 and instinctively reach for my phone to check if Savannah had texted. I would feel a sharp, urgent pull in my chest, a desperate need to call her to make sure Richard had finalized his deals, to see if they needed help with the landscaping or the grocery shopping. Motherhood does not just disappear because you change your zip code. It is an addiction to being needed. You spend decades anticipating disasters and smoothing out the road for your child, and when that responsibility is suddenly removed, you are left with a terrifying empty void. I felt a tremendous guilt pulling at the corners of my mind. I wondered if I was being too harsh. I wondered if the punishment was greater than the crime. But then I remembered the cold look in Savannah's eyes in the pantry. I remembered her telling me that my death would be a convenient gift. That memory was my shield. I forced myself to endure the withdrawal. I forced myself to walk out onto the porch every single time the urge to fix things overwhelmed me. I began to hike the trails behind the cabin. I pushed my lungs and my legs until the physical exhaustion overpowered the emotional panic. I learned how to chop kindling for the stove. I sat in a wooden rocking chair and read books I had purchased 10 years ago but never had the time to open. I watched the sun rise over the ridge and slowly learned how to exist solely for myself. I learned that I was a complete person without my daughter's demands defining my daily schedule. The mountain air was cold and clean, and with every breath I took my mind grew sharper. The emotional fog of being a discarded parent slowly burned away. Meanwhile, back in the city, the invisible financial clock I had started was ticking down to 0. The first domino fell exactly 12 days after my departure. Richard Sterling thrived on the illusion of limitless wealth. He needed his peers to believe he was invincible. His elite country club membership was the cornerstone of that illusion. He entertained clients there, bought expensive lunches, and signed deals on the pristine greens of the golf course. Because I had canceled the automatic bank drafts, the monthly membership dues failed to process. The club's billing department attempted to run the card 3 separate times before flagging the account. On a busy Thursday afternoon, Richard walked into the country club dining room with 2 prospective investors. He ordered a bottle of expensive wine and told the waiter to put it on his account. The waiter returned 5 minutes later looking incredibly uncomfortable. He quietly informed Richard that his account had been suspended for non-payment. The investors heard every word. Richard's face turned crimson with humiliation. He pulled out his personal credit card, demanding the waiter run it immediately. The card was declined. The financial firewall I had built was doing its job. Richard was forced to ask his investors to cover the bill. In his world, that was a fatal display of weakness. The polished veneer of his success had cracked in front of the exact people he was trying to impress. But the country club was only a minor tremor. The catastrophic earthquake hit the following Monday. The massive commercial balloon payment on Richard's business loan became due. For 2 years, I had quietly funneled thousands of dollars into that account to keep it current. Without my safety net, the payment bounced entirely. The bank's automated system immediately flagged the commercial loan as delinquent. Because I had removed myself as the primary guarantor, the bank instantly initiated a mandatory risk assessment on Richard's firm. They froze his operating accounts. They blocked his access to his business credit lines. Richard sat in his high-rise office staring at a computer screen flooded with red notifications. The panic he felt must have been suffocating. His entire business model relied on moving money he did not actually own. Without my liquidity backing his ventures, he was completely exposed. The financial illusion he had built was instantly shattered by my absence. He could not make payroll. He could not cover his pending trades. The carefully constructed life he and Savannah had flaunted at the birthday gala was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. And the most brilliant part of it all was that I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. I simply had to stop catching them when they fell. I set up a secure encrypted email line with Harrison Caldwell before I left the city. Once a week I would drive my sturdy little sedan down the winding mountain road to a small diner in the valley that offered a reliable internet connection. I would order a black coffee, open my laptop, and read the updates. Harrison was a meticulous man who dealt exclusively in fax timelines and legal maneuvers. His emails were stripped of all emotion, which was exactly what I required. Through his precise updates, I watched the destruction of my daughter's manufactured life unfold from 300 miles away. It took exactly 18 days for Savannah to notice I was missing. She did not drive to my house to check on my well-being. She did not call the local hospitals to see if I had been admitted with a medical emergency. She only realized I was gone because the bank called her. When the massive commercial loan payment bounced, the bank immediately flagged the account and reached out to the primary contacts. Savannah received a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon from a very polite, very firm collections officer asking for my updated financial information. According to Harrison, Savannah panicked. She tried calling my cell phone. She tried calling my landline. She encountered only disconnected tones and automated messages stating the numbers were no longer in service. Her immediate reaction was not fear for my safety. Her immediate reaction was absolute outrage. Savannah called my sister Helen later that evening. Helen lives in a quiet suburb outside of Boston and has never had any patience for Savannah's theatrical behavior. I had called Helen the day I left my house. I explained everything that happened at the birthday gala. I detailed the financial reality I'd been hiding for years, and I told her my exact plan. Helen had listened quietly, expressed her profound disgust at her niece, and promised to handle any incoming calls with the exact level of coldness they deserved. Savannah shrieked into the phone when Helen answered. She demanded to know where I was hiding. She complained bitterly that I was throwing a ridiculous tantrum over a tiny misunderstanding at a dinner party. She told Helen that my petty childish behavior was actively ruining their credit scores and jeopardizing Richard's entire career. Savannah insisted that Helen force me to call the bank and authorize the immediate transfer of funds to cover the delinquent commercial loan. Helen did not raise her voice. She let Savannah exhaust her angry tirade, taking a sip of her evening tea, while my daughter ranted about her social standing and her impending financial ruin. When Savannah finally stopped to take a breath, Helen spoke with absolute freezing precision. Helen told Savannah that I was not throwing a tantrum. Helen informed her that I had simply given Savannah the exact birthday gift she had so clearly and aggressively demanded. Savannah had asked for my permanent absence, and I had granted it. Helen then told my daughter that she had absolutely no idea where I was, and that she would not pass along any messages even if she did. Helen ended the call by suggesting Savannah figure out how to pay her own bills for the first time in her adult life. Then Helen hung up the phone and blocked Savannah's number. While Savannah was throwing fits over her social embarrassment, Richard was facing a completely different level of terror. Without my continuous stream of liquid cash, his investment fund was entirely insolvent. He was essentially running a shell game using my retirement savings to cover his bad market bets and maintain the illusion of a highly profitable brokerage. When my money vanished, the entire structure began to collapse instantly. His private investors were wealthy, demanding individuals who expected their quarterly returns to arrive on time. They did not accept excuses about temporary cash flow issues. They wanted their money, and Richard did not have it. Harrison reported that Richard was growing increasingly desperate. He was pacing the floors of his high-rise office, frantically searching for any available capital to stop the bleeding. He needed a massive injection of cash immediately, or he would be facing devastating fraud investigations from both his investors and the federal regulatory agencies. Richard could not secure a traditional bank loan because his credit was already tied to the failing commercial debt. He had no wealthy friends willing to bail him out of a sinking ship. He was completely out of options. Then Richard remembered my house, my beautiful, sturdy, entirely paid-off brick house in the suburbs. It was a highly valuable asset, sitting completely unencumbered by any mortgages or liens. Richard knew the current market value was incredibly high. He also knew that I was nowhere to be found. He assumed my house was just sitting there, an empty piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. Richard went into his personal filing cabinet and pulled out an old general power of attorney document. I had signed that document 6 years ago before a major surgery. It was designed to allow him to handle my medical bills and basic financial obligations in the event I was incapacitated during recovery. It was a standard routine precaution. I had completely forgotten it existed, but Richard had kept it. He looked at the heavy legal seal on the document and saw his salvation. He assumed he could use that outdated piece of paper to march into a bank, leverage the equity in my empty home, and secure a $500,000 loan to save his failing business. He believed he was outsmarting an old woman. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. Harrison Caldwell sent an urgent email the following Thursday. I was sitting on the wooden porch of my mountain cabin, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching a light rain fall across the valley. I opened the message and read Harrison's precise, careful words. He informed me that Richard had officially initiated the process to secure a massive home equity line of credit against my property. Richard had submitted the old power of attorney to a regional bank, claiming I was traveling abroad indefinitely, and had authorized him to leverage the asset for investment purposes. Harrison asked me if I wanted his firm to intervene immediately and block the transaction by filing an injunction. I smiled, closed my laptop, and took a slow, deep breath of the cold mountain air. I felt absolutely no panic. I felt no urge to rush down the mountain and stop Richard from stealing my home. I simply typed a brief reply to Harrison, instructing him to let Richard proceed right up to the edge of the cliff. My lack of concern was not born out of ignorance or foolishness. It was born out of a profound, unshakable trust in my late husband. Thomas had been a brilliant actuary. He spent 40 years calculating statistical probabilities, risk factors, and human behavioral patterns. He was a man who saw the world through the cold, undeniable logic of mathematics and consequence. He never operated on blind faith. He operated on data. And the data told him that Richard Sterling was a predator. Years before the cancer took him, Thomas had sat at our dining room table surrounded by property deeds and estate planning documents. He told me that he loved me deeply, but he knew my maternal instinct would always be my greatest vulnerability. He knew I would give Savannah everything I had, and he knew Richard would happily take it all and leave me destitute. Thomas decided to build an invisible, impenetrable fortress around my primary asset. He did not tell Savannah. He certainly did not tell Richard. He only told Harrison Caldwell and me. Thomas legally restructured the deed to our home. He embedded a highly specific, strictly enforced occupancy and abandonment clause directly into the title language. The clause was a masterpiece of actuarial foresight. It stated that if the primary beneficiary, which was me, vacated the property for more than 14 consecutive days without providing direct in-person, notarized authorization to a managing legal firm, the title of the house would automatically and irreversibly transfer out of my name. It would instantly funnel into a blind, irrevocable trust managed entirely by Harrison Caldwell's law firm. The genius of the clause was its absolute rigidity. It was designed to prevent elder financial abuse. If someone forced me out of my home, or if I was placed in a facility against my will, the house could not be sold or leveraged by greedy relatives. The moment the 14-day window closed, the asset essentially locked itself in a vault. Any prior power of attorney, regardless of when it was signed, would be instantly nullified regarding that specific property. The house belonged to the trust, and the trust answered only to Harrison Caldwell. As I sat on my porch listening to the rain, I calculated the timeline. I had walked out of Savannah's kitchen on a Friday evening. It had been over 5 weeks since I left my home. 5 long weeks of complete silence. I had not returned to the property. I had not provided any notarized authorization to Harrison's firm. The 14-day window had closed almost a month ago. The trap had already snapped shut. By demanding my permanent absence, Savannah had handed me the exact key needed to activate the safeguard. By ignoring my disappearance for weeks, because she was too angry and embarrassed by my existence, she had guaranteed that the 14-day clause would run its course undisturbed. Had she driven to my house out of genuine concern during those first 2 weeks, she might have realized I was gone. She might have tried to intervene. But her pride and her cruelty kept her away. Her absolute neglect was the final necessary ingredient to complete Thomas's brilliant equation. Richard was currently running around the city meeting with loan officers and presenting his outdated power of attorney with desperate confidence. He believed he was holding the golden ticket to his financial salvation. He thought he was leveraging my home to pay off his furious private investors and save his country club lifestyle. He had absolutely no idea that the house he was trying to mortgage legally belonged to a blind trust that viewed him as a hostile threat. I finished my coffee and watched the rain wash over the dense pine trees. I felt a deep, profound connection to Thomas in that moment. Even from beyond the grave, my husband was protecting me from the wolves. I did not need to scream or fight or beg for respect. I simply needed to fade into nothing and let their own breathtaking arrogance trigger their destruction. Richard and Savannah had dug their own financial grave, and I was perfectly content to sit on my mountain and let them fall into it. Richard Sterling sat in a heavy leather chair across from a regional bank manager. The air conditioning in the office was set to a freezing temperature, but Richard felt a hot, prickling sweat gathering at the back of his neck. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom Italian suit, trying to project the calm, untouchable confidence that usually won him millions. He smiled and pushed a thick leather folder across the polished mahogany desk. Inside the folder was the general power of attorney document Clara had signed 5 years ago. Richard smoothly explained that his wife's mother was traveling extensively and had authorized him to take out a $500,000 home equity line of credit against her property to fund a highly lucrative commercial development. He leaned back, expecting the loan officer to eagerly process the paperwork. Instead, the bank manager, a stern man with graying hair, slid the folder back across the desk without opening it. The manager folded his hands and looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. He explained that a standard title search had already been conducted on the property. The manager stated flatly that the house was no longer in Clara Hayes' name. Richard felt the air physically leave his lungs. He forced a strained laugh, insisting there must be some sort of clerical error in the county records. He tapped the folder loudly, reminding the manager that the power of attorney gave him absolute legal authority to correct any administrative mistakes. The bank manager did not smile. He opened his computer terminal and turned the screen so Richard could see the official county filing. The manager explained the exact nature of the deed. He told Richard that the property was currently locked inside an irrevocable blind trust. The trust had been automatically activated by a legally binding occupancy clause embedded deep within the original title. Because Clara had vacated the premises for more than 14 consecutive days, the house had legally transferred out of her possession and into the absolute control of a private legal firm. The manager looked Richard directly in the eyes and told him that the old power of attorney was completely invalid. Richard could not borrow a single dime against the house. The equity was untouchable. Richard stood up so quickly that his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He grabbed his folder and walked out of the bank, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. When Richard returned to his high-rise office, his pristine illusion of wealth was violently cracking apart. His private cell phone buzzed endlessly on his glass desk, the sound vibrating like a warning alarm through the quiet room. He stared at the caller identification screen, feeling a cold knot of genuine terror twisting in his stomach. The caller was a man named Vance, an individual who represented a syndicate of private, unregulated investors. These were not forgiving corporate bankers who filed extensions or offered grace periods. They were dangerous, quiet men who operated entirely outside the boundaries of traditional finance and the law. They did not accept frantic apologies, and they did not care about sudden market fluctuations. They expected their guaranteed quarterly returns to be deposited precisely on time down to the exact hour. Without Clara's liquid cash to quietly cover his massive ongoing market losses, Richard was completely insolvent. He finally answered the phone, his voice shaking despite his desperate, practiced attempts to sound completely in control. The man on the other end of the line did not yell. He spoke in a soft, measuring tone that promised absolute destruction. The investor informed Richard that he had exactly 72 hours to produce the missing capital. The man made it terrifyingly clear that if the money did not materialize, the consequences would extend far beyond a ruined credit score or a seized bank account. Driven into a corner by men who could end his life, Richard made a frantic, desperate move. He realized that the only way to break the irrevocable trust was to find Clara and force her to sign a legal revocation in the presence of an attorney. He pulled out a hidden ledger and hired a highly expensive, deeply discreet private investigator. Richard met the investigator in a dimly lit coffee shop on the edge of the city. He handed over an envelope containing a thick stack of $100 bills, a photograph of Clara, her social security number, and the license plate of her vehicle. Richard put on a flawless performance. He claimed he was a deeply concerned son, trying to locate an elderly woman who was suffering from severe cognitive decline. He told the investigator that Clara had wandered away from home and desperately needed medical intervention. The investigator pocketed the cash, asked no further questions, and promised to deliver her exact coordinates within 48 hours. Richard spent the next 2 days pacing his office like a trapped animal. He drank black coffee and stared out at the city skyline, waiting for the phone to ring. When the investigator finally called on Thursday afternoon, Richard's desperate hope was instantly shattered. The investigator sounded incredibly frustrated. He reported that Clara Hayes was a complete ghost. She had not used a single credit card or accessed any known bank accounts. Her cell phone had been deactivated and completely disconnected from the digital grid. The investigator had managed to track her vehicle to a wholesale auto dealership 3 counties away, but the trail ended there. Clara had sold her car for cold, untraceable cash. She had not signed a new residential lease, registered a new vehicle, or activated any local utilities. She had completely vanished into the vast, undocumented expanse of the country. Richard slammed his phone down on his desk. The sheer blinding panic boiled over into a violent, uncontrollable rage. He realized that the quiet, unassuming woman he had mocked for years had utterly outsmarted him. He grabbed a heavy crystal tumbler from his desk and hurled it against the far wall, watching it shatter into 100 glittering pieces. He was entirely trapped and the predators were closing in. Driven to the absolute brink of madness, Richard made a fatal, irreversible error. It was 2:00 on a Sunday morning. The massive suburban mansion was perfectly quiet. Savannah was asleep upstairs, completely unaware that their luxurious life was hours away from total annihilation. Richard sat alone in his dark home office, bathed only in the harsh, singular glow of his brass desk lamp. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he spread a chaotic pile of documents across his leather blotting pad. Before Clara had vanished, she had left behind several boxes of old financial records in their garage. Richard had spent hours frantically digging through those dusty boxes. He had pulled out old canceled checks, birthday cards, and outdated tax returns. He had gathered dozens of perfectly preserved examples of Clara's signature. Richard stared at the glowing screen of his laptop. He knew the exact legal mechanism of the blind trust. The trust was activated automatically because Clara had been absent for 14 consecutive days. Richard reasoned that if he could produce a binding legal document proving that Clara had sold the property to his private holding company before that 14-day window expired, he could argue that the trust activation was a clerical error. He printed a blank, generic warranty deed. He gripped a heavy black fountain pen, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. He placed an old birthday card Clara had signed next to the blank deed. Slowly, meticulously, he began to practice tracing her name onto a yellow legal pad. He copied the sharp angle of her capital C and the sweeping loop of her lowercase letters. He filled page after page with her forged signature, desperately trying to perfectly mimic the handwriting of the woman he had driven away. His breathing was ragged and shallow in the silent room. He was no longer a sophisticated broker. He was a common criminal committing federal fraud. Savannah woke up feeling a strange, unsettling chill in the massive, empty bed. She pulled a heavy silk robe over her shoulders and walked softly down the long carpeted hallway of their mansion. She noticed the thin strip of yellow light spilling out from beneath the heavy oak door of Richard's private office. The emotional stress of the past month had begun to wear heavily on her nerves. Her wealthy friends were starting to whisper about Richard's declined credit cards at the country club, and the sudden, unexplained disappearance of her mother was becoming an embarrassing social mystery Savannah could no longer brush away with casual lies. Savannah pushed the office door open quietly, fully expecting to find Richard asleep at his computer keyboard after another long night of working. Instead, she found her husband hunched aggressively over his mahogany desk, frantically scribbling on a legal pad with a manic intensity. She stepped fully into the room, wrapped her arms around her waist, and asked him what he was doing awake at such a terrible hour. Richard flinched so violently that he knocked a coffee mug across the desk, sending a dark stain soaking into the carpet. He scrambled to cover the blank warranty deed with a newspaper, but he was far too slow. Savannah stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the chaotic mess of documents. She saw her mother's old birthday cards. She saw the yellow legal pad completely covered in her mother's forged signature. A wave of profound, sickening horror washed over her. She looked at Richard, her voice trembling, and asked him if he was attempting to forge her mother's name to steal the house. The polished, charming gentleman Savannah had married instantly vanished. Richard stood up, his face twisted in a vicious, hateful sneer. He snapped at her, his voice dripping with pure venom. He pointed a shaking finger at Savannah and blamed her for everything. He told her to look around at her expensive shoes, her luxury cars, and her ridiculous gala dinners. He told her that her beautiful lifestyle cost money he simply did not have. He demanded that she keep her mouth shut and play along with his desperate lie, screaming that if she said a single word, they would both end up serving decades in a federal penitentiary. Savannah stood perfectly still in the center of the dimly lit office, unable to formulate a single word. The magnificent, wealthy world she believed she commanded shattered completely right in front of her eyes. She looked at the man she had married and finally saw the terrifying, undeniable truth. The sophisticated investment broker she had proudly paraded in front of her friends was nothing but a desperate, cornered thief drowning in his own deceit. And then the ultimate crushing realization washed over her entire body like freezing water. For years, she had deeply, bitterly resented her mother. She had mocked her mother's sensible choices, her practical clothes, and her quiet demeanor. She had constantly accused her mother of being a controlling, embarrassing burden who simply could not fit into their elevated social circle. But standing in the absolute wreckage of her husband's criminal failure, Savannah realized her mother had never been controlling them at all. Her mother had been fiercely, silently shielding them from Richard's staggering financial incompetence. Her mother had been the only wall keeping the predators away from their front door. Savannah realized that when she pulled her mother into that pantry and viciously demanded her permanent absence as a birthday gift, she had not just broken an old woman's heart. She had arrogantly kicked away the only pillar holding up her entire existence. By demanding her mother's disappearance to preserve her own vanity, she had single-handedly destroyed their only safety net. The sheer suffocating weight of her own arrogant foolishness hit her so hard she dropped to her knees on the stained carpet, entirely unable to breathe. Richard Sterling believed he had executed the perfect crime. He sat in his darkened home office, holding the forged warranty deed up to the desk lamp, admiring his own deceitful handiwork. The signature of Clara Hayes looked absolutely flawless. He had spent hours practicing the exact curve of her capital letters and the slight downward slope of her cursive script until it was indistinguishable from the real thing. Richard convinced himself that the blind trust was nothing more than a temporary administrative hurdle. He believed that with a backdated document proving a sale to his private holding company, before Clara vanished, his massive loan would be approved. He quickly scheduled a closing appointment with a private lending group he had found through a quiet broker. The lender specialized in high-risk, high-reward collateral loans, and Richard was desperate enough to accept their brutal interest rates. He needed $500,000 immediately to satisfy the dangerous men breathing down his neck. He felt a surge of arrogant triumph. He believed he had outsmarted a dead actuary and an old woman. Hundreds of miles away in a quiet mountain cabin, Clara Hayes sat on her wooden porch drinking black coffee. The morning air was crisp and clear. Her satellite phone, which she kept specifically for emergencies, buzzed on the small wooden table. It was Harrison Caldwell. Her late husband's brilliant estate attorney did not waste time with pleasantries. He told Clara that the automated county title monitoring system had just triggered a massive red flag. Someone had officially filed a transfer of deed request against her suburban property, claiming a private sale to an entity controlled entirely by Richard Sterling. Harrison explained that Richard had taken the bait perfectly. By submitting the forged document across state electronic systems to secure a wire transfer, he had elevated a desperate lie into federal wire fraud and felony forgery. Harrison told Clara in his calm, measured voice that the game was officially over. It was time for her to come down from the mountain and finish what her husband had started. Clara did not feel any anxiety. She felt the cool, steady resolution of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own power. She packed her small bag, locked the cabin, and drove down the mountain road toward the city. The private lending office was located on the 42nd floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise building. Richard walked into the massive glass-enclosed conference room, feeling like a conquering king. He wore his finest custom-tailored suit. He adjusted his silk tie and looked out at the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. He believed he was moments away from saving his empire. He sat down at the sleek black marble conference table and confidently placed his leather briefcase in front of him. Savannah sat in the chair right next to him. She did not look like a wealthy socialite today. She looked like a woman walking toward her own execution. Her face was completely pale and drained of all color. Her hands shook violently in her lap. Savannah knew exactly what Richard was doing. She had seen the forged signature. She knew that sitting in this room made her a direct accessory to a massive federal crime. She felt a suffocating terror tightening her chest. She looked at Richard and begged him in a frantic whisper to stop before it was too late. She pleaded with him to walk away and face their financial ruin honestly. Richard ignored her completely. He leaned closer and hissed at her to keep her mouth shut and smile. He told her they were 5 minutes away from securing the capital needed to maintain their entire life. He refused to let her fear ruin his masterpiece. The heavy oak door at the far end of the conference room opened. A well-dressed attorney representing the private lending group walked in carrying a thick stack of closing documents. He smiled politely and sat across from Richard. He asked for the primary collateral document. Richard smoothly slid the forged warranty deed across the polished marble table. He pushed it forward with absolute confidence, fully believing his lie was impenetrable. The attorney picked up the deed. He pulled out a pair of reading glasses and examined the signature for a long, agonizing minute. Richard held his breath. Savannah closed her eyes and silently prayed for a miracle. The attorney lowered the paper. He looked directly at Richard with a perfectly pleasant business smile. He told Richard that the document looked entirely in order. He arranged the final wire transfer forms on the table and picked up a heavy silver pen. Richard felt a massive wave of euphoric relief wash over his entire body. He had actually done it. He had won. Then the attorney stopped. He placed the pen back down on the table. He looked at Richard and smiled politely. He said there is just one final signature required by the title insurance underwriter before we release the funds. Richard frowned. He asked what signature could possibly be missing. He stated aggressively that he had full power of attorney and the holding company documents were completely finalized. He demanded the money be transferred immediately. Before the lending attorney could answer, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. The sound of the latch clicking echoed like a gunshot in the quiet space. Richard turned his head, expecting to see a bank assistant or a notary. Clara Hayes walked into the room. She was no longer the tired, overly accommodating mother wearing sensible shoes and outdated navy dresses. She was completely transformed. She was deeply tanned from weeks of mountain sun. She looked incredibly rested, vibrant, and alive. She was wearing a remarkably sharp, tailored charcoal suit that fit her perfectly. She wore no jewelry except her late husband's silver brooch. She walked into the massive corporate room projecting absolute, undeniable authority. Her posture was straight and her gaze was entirely unyielding. She looked like a woman who owned the building. Richard stopped breathing. All the color instantly vanished from his face. His mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. Savannah let out a sharp, terrified gasp and pressed both hands against her mouth. She stared at her mother as if she were looking at a ghost materializing in broad daylight. Harrison Caldwell walked into the conference room immediately behind Clara. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and wore a grim, uncompromising expression. Right behind Harrison walked two state financial fraud investigators wearing dark suits and carrying official credentials on their belts. They stepped into the room and silently took their positions by the glass doors, completely blocking any possible exit. The silence in the conference room was absolute and terrifying. Richard stared at Clara with wide, unblinking eyes. His mind completely shattered, trying to comprehend how the woman he believed was wandering aimlessly through the countryside was now standing in a locked corporate boardroom with law enforcement. Clara did not yell. She did not scream or throw insults. She walked slowly toward the marble conference table. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She stopped right across from Richard. She looked down at the forged warranty deed resting perfectly on the table. She looked at her own fake signature. She did not show any anger. She showed only a cold, calculating disappointment. Clara looked directly into Richard's terrified eyes. She spoke with a voice that was perfectly calm and devastatingly clear. She said, "My husband calculated that you would resort to theft within 60 days of my money running out." She let the silence stretch for one agonizing second. Then she continued, "You did it in 45. Richard began to visibly panic. He stammered frantically, trying to form a coherent sentence. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara and shouted that she had abandoned the property. He claimed the sale was legitimate and that he was simply protecting the family assets from her obvious mental decline. He looked at the lending attorney and desperately demanded that the wire transfer be finalized immediately. Clara smiled a small, freezing smile. She looked at Richard and finally delivered the fatal blow. She revealed the absolute genius of the trap. Clara told Richard that the private lending group he had been desperately dealing with for the past week did not actually exist. She explained that the entire lending company was nothing more than a subsidiary holding corporation owned completely by Harrison Caldwell's law firm. Richard's entire body began to shake violently. The reality of his absolute destruction crashed down on him. Clara continued, her voice echoing with absolute finality in the sleek room. She explained that Harrison had intentionally approved his initial loan application specifically to pull him out of the shadows. They had deliberately staged this entire closing appointment to catch Richard committing federal wire fraud and felony forgery in real time. They needed him to willingly hand over a forged legal document across state lines while attempting to secure a fraudulent cash transfer. He had walked perfectly into a flawlessly designed legal snare. There was absolutely no escape. Harrison Caldwell opened his briefcase and pulled out the original certified copy of the irrevocable blind trust. He tossed it onto the marble table right next to Richard's pathetic forgery. Harrison looked at Richard and stated that his actions today constituted multiple severe federal crimes. He informed Richard that the documents had already been transmitted to the district attorney's office. One of the state fraud investigators stepped forward. He instructed Richard to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Richard tried to look at Savannah for help, but Savannah was completely paralyzed with shock and terror. She sat in her chair sobbing uncontrollably, realizing that her entire luxurious life was evaporating in front of her eyes. Richard slowly stood up. His arrogant posture was completely broken. He looked like a hollow, defeated man. The investigator pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic click of the restraint snapping shut around Richard's wrists echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. The investigator read Richard his rights, while firmly guiding him toward the heavy glass doors. Richard did not fight back. He did not yell or threaten anyone. He simply hung his head in absolute humiliation and defeat. The financial predator had finally been caged. Clara stood tall and unwavering at the head of the marble table. She watched the investigators lead the man who had tried to steal her life out of the room. She felt no guilt. She felt no regret. She felt only the profound, incredible peace of a woman who had finally balanced the scales. She had given her daughter her permanent absence, and in doing so, she had protected her husband's legacy from being destroyed by greed. The trap had sprung perfectly, and the ghost had finally returned to finish the story. The aftermath of the sting operation was swift and merciless. Richard Sterling did not return to his luxury mansion that evening. He was processed through a federal facility facing severe charges for wire fraud and forgery. The grand illusion of wealth he desperately maintained shattered entirely. Dangerous private investors seized the remaining assets of his failing brokerage firm. Without my quiet financial backing, his world evaporated in days. Savannah was left standing in the wreckage of a life she no longer recognized. The mansion she proudly decorated was heavily mortgaged and headed for foreclosure. The expensive cars, the country club memberships, the designer clothes dissolved. At 42 years old, Savannah faced absolute financial ruin. She had no savings and a mountain of crushing debt left behind by a polished criminal. She faced the horrifying prospect of starting over. 2 weeks after Richard's arrest, the trust initiated the process of selling my former home. Harrison Caldwell sent a team of professionals to prepare the property for the market. I drove down from the mountains one final time to sign the necessary closure documents. The house felt incredibly different now. The walls were bare, the floors were clean, and the rooms echoed with a profound emptiness. It no longer felt like a museum of my past. It simply felt like a structure made of wood and brick, waiting for a new family to give it meaning. I stood in the center of the living room, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and floor polish. I felt no lingering sadness. I only felt the clean light sensation of moving forward. Then the front door slowly opened. Savannah walked into the empty living room. She looked absolutely terrible. The emerald silk dresses and flawless diamond earrings were gone. She wore a simple faded sweater and flat shoes. Her face was pale, her eyes were completely red and swollen from crying, and her shoulders slumped with the heavy, agonizing weight of total defeat. She looked at the bare walls, and then she looked at me. For a long, painful moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, filling the empty room with all the things that had been broken over the past few months. Savannah suddenly dropped to her knees right there on the bare hardwood floor. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The sound was raw and broken, completely stripped of her usual arrogance and entitlement. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and begged for my forgiveness. She admitted everything. She confessed that she had been horribly foolish and incredibly selfish. She told me how Richard had manipulated her, blinding her to his constant failures. She cried that she had taken my love for granted her entire life. She reached out toward me, begging me to help her, begging me to step back into the role of her financial savior. She pleaded with me to use the money from the sale of the house to bail her out, to pay for her lawyers to rescue her from the devastating consequences of her own terrible choices. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the daughter I had sacrificed everything for. I did not feel any anger anymore. I did not feel the freezing heartbreak I had experienced in her walk-in pantry on the night of her birthday. I felt a deep, profound sympathy for her pain, but I also felt an absolute, unyielding boundary. I let her cry until her tears began to slow. I crouched down so I was looking directly into her eyes. I validated her pain. I told her I understood how terrified she must be. I told her it was a horrible thing to realize the person you married was a complete fraud. I spoke with genuine softness, but my voice carried the immovable weight of a woman who had finally learned her own value. I looked deeply into her red, swollen eyes. I spoke slowly and clearly. I forgive you for the birthday party, but I will not save you from the consequences of your own life anymore. I gave you my absence, and I found my peace in it. Savannah stopped crying. She stared at me, and in that exact moment she finally understood. She saw that the quiet, accommodating mother she had bullied and drained for decades was permanently gone. I stood back up, smoothed my jacket, and turned around. I walked out the front door and down the driveway, leaving her kneeling in the empty house. I did not look back. The drive back to the Blue Ridge Mountains felt incredibly fast. The highway stretched open and clear before me. I watched the city skyline slowly fade away in my rearview mirror. As I climbed higher into the mountain roads, the dense pine trees wrapped around my car like a protective embrace. I pulled up the gravel driveway to my small off-grid cabin. The air was cool and smelled of fresh earth and cedar. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and walked inside my sanctuary. I made a fresh pot of coffee and walked out onto the wide wooden porch. I sat in my sturdy rocking chair and pulled a blanket over me. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set over the sweeping valley. I watched light dance through the tops of the ancient trees. There were no ringing phones. There was only the sound of the mountain wind and the steady beating of my own heart. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked out over the endless green horizon and smiled. I had finally stopped trying to buy love from people who only knew how to take. I was 71 years old and my life was finally mine. I embraced the quiet, unapologetic reality of my golden years. The trap had closed, the debts were settled, and I was beautifully free.